Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Our webinar will commence very shortly. And we'll just wait for some more attendees to join. Great. We have some more to join. Right, thank you very much for joining us this morning and welcome to our webinar on staying secure in an insecure world, hosted by myself, Liz Nevitt from Dedicate Recruitment and Taria Eiler at Aston Education. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we commence. If you'd like to put a question to Gary, please do use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and then we will endeavour to ask all questions on your behalf. If you want to put a general comment for everyone to see, please do put a comment in the chat box on the panel on the right hand side. And this session will be recorded. We won't disclose anyone's names for privacy reasons, and hope you enjoy the presentation. So I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Gary Hibberd, who is all things cyberware. He comes with a wealth of experience, 35 years within IT, but also the last 20 years specialising in cyber security. And he is going to hopefully answer any questions or any thoughts that you have on cyberware. So he's a published author and an international speaker on cybersecurity, crime, terrorism, psychology. So you are in very good hands. And now pass over to Gary.
Thank you. No, thank you very much, Liz. First of all, good morning, everybody. I hope you're safe and well. And thanks to Taria and to Liz for inviting me along on behalf of Dedicate Recruitment and Aston Education to talk about cybersecurity, staying secure in an insecure world, not an unsecure, but an insecure world. I think that's where we find ourselves today. As Liz has said, there will be opportunity at the end of this presentation to ask any questions related to anything that I've said, anything I've raised, or indeed any thoughts you have about this particular topic and any concerns around data protection and cybersecurity. Liz has done a great introduction there, and I think it's worth knowing really just that on top of that 35 years of experience comes a real passion and enthusiasm for this topic. What I'm about to share with you is not intended to scare you. It is not intended to stop you from using technology. I'm a real lover of tech. I wouldn't have done it for 35 years if I didn't. So I started in this field when I was a mere boy, and I fell in love with technology, and it was obviously in its infancy then. This is before the days of the internet. This is before hacking got the negative connotations that it has today. So I started life as a hacker. At the time, there was no such thing as a good hacker or a bad hacker. It was just, you were just taking systems apart or software apart to see what you could do with it to manipulate the code, to make it do things that you wanted it to do. And that, by and large, is where hackers are today. Some of the motivations we're going to talk about in this presentation are no different to the motivations that I had when I first started out in this discipline. So when I do talk about hackers, don't automatically think I'm talking about cyber criminals, because cyber criminals and hackers are two different things. So in terms of my background and where I am today, I am the professor of communicating cyber. So I do a lot of these kind of talks, but I talk to everybody from young children, primary school, all the way through education up to university level. I do lectures. I am an executive in residence at Sheffield Hallam University. I sit on various boards of various academic and also research facilities, and I work with various different law enforcement agencies as well. And so I come at this from a very real world practical standpoint. So the things I'm going to share with you now, as I said, are not intended to turn you off technology. What I'm here to do really is open your eyes to some of the issues that are around us. So we are going to cover a number of things. We are going to talk about who is being targeted. We're going to talk about who the bad guys are and who they aren't. And I kind of alluded to some of that a second ago. We are going to talk about some real practical things you can and should be doing right now, including finding the gaps in your thinking, in your knowledge, and in your organizations, but also then giving you some real practical tools that you can take away from today, and that perhaps, and you definitely should be looking to implement. And this doesn't really matter whether you are from the education sector or from any other industry. But I will be touching on some of the educational challenges that we have, both from an academic point of view, but also broader than that. But I'll explain a little later. All of this really comes into helping raise your awareness and your knowledge around cybersecurity. There's a big push within cybersecurity and information security to get people to engage with these topics in a little bit more detail. The problem is that when we talk about information security awareness, quite often people dive straight into the detail about password security or risk management and such. And the problem with that is that people don't care. So just because they're aware doesn't mean they care. So this is the reason why this presentation is kind of broken up into two parts. The first part of this is very much around the context, and then the second is very much around some practical tips and tools and things you should be looking to do. So it's all about knowledge, because when we talk about security, what we're really talking about is risk. And I firmly believe that the biggest risk that we face at this point in time is complacency. There is a lack of understanding or appreciation of just how big this problem actually is, or this challenge is. And it is a challenge, and it's a challenge that each one of us has to embrace, both individually and collectively, as a society, and within organizations and in governments and internationally. I've spoken at schools, as I've already mentioned, and I love speaking to primary school children. And I remember one in particular put his hand up when I was talking about the web and about, some of the issues that are out there, and about that it's, it's not full of the good people that, we might associate with the good friends. And one person put their hand up, one young boy put his hand up, and he just said, can't we all just round the world sending out the bad people, getting rid of them? If only that were true, if only that was so there is an element that we are going to be kind of try to do some of that, which we will touch upon. Complacency, ignorance is absolutely a real risk for us, and our ignorance, the bad guys feed on, or our lack of knowledge, or our lack of, because it really surprises me when I talk to nations and individuals that simply say to me, look, 10 people in a room, we are a, we manufacture furniture. Why would the cyber criminals? Well, my answer to that question is, yeah, you could be targeting you, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to. The reason why we all talk about phishing, it's not because it's just this nice little idea with a fishing rod. This is some automated, the attacks that they out on individuals to such an extent they can literally troll the ocean of the net, the place that you and I are surfing, children are surfing each and every day, and our mothers and our brothers and our sisters and our partners working in an environment that you have gangs who are acts indiscriminately. If you are in, they don't really care. They're not working for a charity and you're there to try. They don't care if you're working for the NHS and you can stop this latest pandemic. If you are in a financial institution, software to schools, or if you are a school, what you really care about is, do you have data? Then it is of value to them, and then they will exploit any weaknesses or any gaps in your thinking. And the problem is only getting bigger. And it's getting bigger. It was getting bigger for years, for the last 20 years, although being in IT and technology for 35, 20 of those have been very much focused on cybersecurity. And I've watched this steady increase in the risk and the level of threat and vulnerabilities just simply grow. Not because the bad guys are doing anything particularly different, but what they're doing is they're doing the same thing as you or I are doing right now. They're using technology to their own ends, for their own ends. We talk about artificial intelligence, and we talk about how that can improve lives. Well, there are bad guys out there who are looking at artificial intelligence for ways to manipulate you or I, our loved ones, our organizations, our employees, our teams, to such an extent that they can actually weaponize some of the things that they can carry out. And they're doing that in a number of ways. But really, one of the key factors in all of this is the number of devices that we are actually all using now. So whereas data used to sit on a server or in a data center, of course it does to some extent, but because we're living in this disparate, separated, remote world that we're living in right now, we're in a situation where data now exists on people's laptops. It sits on people's mobile devices, on their iPads, etc. And even just looking at this slide here, you can see that purportedly back in 2017, Statistica was saying that by this year, we would have 30 billion devices connected to what's known as the Internet of Things. Now, that Internet of Things is it's getting bigger. And I think back in 2017, certainly nobody would have thought that come 2020, many organizations, perhaps yours too, were forcing people to go and, requiring them to go and work in remote settings, perhaps using devices that weren't set up for office use, therefore using devices that perhaps have been commandeered from the children that may not have been protected or patched or updated or including antivirus software. So when I look at numbers like this now, I have real concerns that the Internet of Things is growing and has grown beyond all imagination just 2 or 3 years ago. So the Internet of Things is, for those who are unaware of it, is essentially just any device which is connected to Wi-Fi and connected to the internet. So anything that where you'll see an advert that says control the heating from your phone, that's an IoT device. If you have one of the doorbells that you can control from your phone, that is a device which is connected to the IoT. I know that some baby monitors are connected to the IoT, and even there, baby monitors have been known to be hacked. And there have been cases where young children have heard voices from the device, which are not their mothers and fathers, but from hackers from around the world who can easily access these devices. Because that network that sits in the middle of the IoT is global. In fact, when we talk about cloud devices and cloud systems, quite often people say to me, well, my data sits on the cloud, and they point to the sky. And whilst I understand that sort of figurative image, you've got to remember that in actual fact, cloud just means somebody else's computer. It sits somewhere in the world, but just like a cloud, you're not quite sure where it sits. So a part of this call to arms today is just to start to think about what devices you are using, what devices you are connecting to the Internet of Things, but also what data sits on those devices and where is it? Because as I've said, all of these devices now are leaving us separated. These are the gaps that I talked about earlier. And in fact, when we talk about these devices and we talk about where we are today and the increase in cybercrime, when I talk to law enforcement agencies, we talk about cybercrime quite regularly. And I've actually said many times over the last, I would say, 5 years to many law enforcement agencies, can we just stop calling it cybercrime? Can we not just call it crime 2.0? Because in actual fact, when we look at the kinds of crimes that are around, or you look at the kinds of cybercrime that are around, the real definition is that there are only two types, and that is computer-enabled crime and computer-dependent crime. And if you look at the kinds of crimes we're talking about, where we talk about computer-enabled crime, many of these crimes have been with us for a millennia. They've been with us since the dawn of man: theft, fraud, money laundering, blackmail, ransom. It is just that the cyber criminals have done, again, what each one of us have done, remembering that they are real people. It is not just a computer. There are real people behind these systems and these attacks. And what they're actually doing is simply weaponizing the tools or these crimes and using technology for their own ends. So when we look at computer-dependent crime, so this is probably a little bit more what you would traditionally think as being a computer crime or cyber crime. So when I talk to organizations on the first pass, and I will say, well, what type of cyber crimes do you see? And they'll say, well, we're afraid of hacking and we're afraid of ransomware. And I'll say, well, I understand that, but what about fraud? And they say, oh, we've got fraud covered. That's handled by our finance team. Okay. What about theft? What intellectual property theft? Someone stealing your ideas, or just taking the data that you hold and selling it to somebody else. Could be a competitor, of course. It could be sold on the black market. We see that all the time. And when I talk about data, remembering that data just isn't just names and addresses, it's banking details, it's photographs, it's images, it's video. So all of this information has a value. And if you go on the dark markets, you go into the dark web, which is an area which it's not against the law to visit. If you're interested in knowing how to get to the dark web, many children know how to get to the dark web. And I'm not giving any secrets away here. Depending upon where you are in the world, it's advisable to be very careful about going to the dark web. But like anything, if you want to know how to get to the dark web, you Google how to get to the dark web. So we need to remember and recognize that these tools are out there and that people are on those in those areas selling the data that we have. And quite often when you hear about large data breaches, you will find them on the dark web. And every piece of data that we have has a value. So your name and address and telephone number and your bank card will perhaps get $1 for every one of those. If you have the CVV number, the number that's on the back of the card, that goes up to $5 per card. So when you hear about these large numbers and you hear the companies being hacked and 1,000 data sets have been stolen, or 2,000 or 3,000 or 10,000 or 100,000, it doesn't take much to the imagination to realize this is why the bad guys have gone to where they've gone. But coming back to this point about the cyber crimes themselves, if you look at the list on the left and the right of your screens, you can see that this pretty much encapsulated most kinds of crimes, which is why it's no surprise to me when I speak to DCIs and they tell me that 50% of all crime is now cyber related. You know, traditionally, historically, before I'd explained to this level, you might have thought that burglary wouldn't have a cyber aspect to it. But of course it does, because cyber criminals, or rather burglars, are just like any human being. We're pretty lazy by nature, and we will look for an easy route. And therefore, why not use Street View? Why not use Google Maps to map out your next locations that you might decide to attack? Now, I'm again not giving away any trade secrets here. This is not suddenly creating new burglars and new methods of attack. Burglars have known this for years. The police have known it for years. My job is to make sure that you are now aware of these particular issues and these vulnerabilities. But who does actually care about all of this stuff? Well, of course, as far as I'm concerned, you know, I think starting from an academic point of view, children, parents, students, they care about this kind of thing, because we're seeing sort of headlines like this on our pages, across our news sites all the time. Fraudsters exploiting COVID-19 fears have scammed 1.6 million, which I'm going to come on to again shortly. But who else cares? Where shareholders care, your employees care, your suppliers, the media, of course, your customers care, the government cares. They have a new regulation, or it's not that new, it's actually been around for 4 years. Well, since 2016, came into force in 2018. Of course, I'm talking about the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. But we're seeing headlines like this on our pages day in, day out, telling us about data breaches. And the numbers are staggering. And the numbers are so big that it's almost easy to get lost in these numbers to such a degree that you almost ignore what those numbers are. Now, for me, whenever I see a number of 170,000 or 14 million or 600,000 or 70,000, I instantly imagine a single person. And then I imagine Wembley Stadium full to the brim. And then I multiply that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. That is the amount of individuals that are now impacted by these kinds of breaches. And again, it's not just that we're being targeted in commercial settings. Universities are routinely attacked because they have large swathes of data. It is valuable to the bad guys. But we're also creating problems for ourselves because we don't understand GDPR. So data breaches are going to increase during this current time because we're doing things like this. We're sending letters out with information on that to a large swathe of people that perhaps people's privacy and their right to security is being mistreated or forgotten. And of course, just this last week, we've had a latest breach. Police and council chief mistakenly exposed information on 8.6 million car journeys. How can that data be exploited? Well, that's an exercise for you. I have a view of how that data could be exploited. One of the great things about these kinds of stories, if there can be any kind of great thing that comes out of it, is that you can use these as information for your exercises when you are actually talking to your teams about cybersecurity and raising their awareness around the importance of privacy. The question you have to ask is, if you were a bad guy, what would you do with that data? What could you use it for? How could you monetize it? Think like a businessman, but act like a criminal. That's really the kind of information that you really should be taking back to your teams and actually starting to work upon. Because we are living, of course, in insecure times. These are times of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I don't think there's any denying that where we are now, irrespective of your political views or your views around what COVID-19 is or isn't, and the conspiracy theories around it. We are all living in anxious times. And during those anxious times, that is a time when the bad guys love to strike, because they love nothing more than instilling fear, uncertainty, and doubt. They've done it for years. They have always exploited major incidents and major crises around the world, whether it's a bushfire in Australia, whether it's an earthquake in China, whether it's Red Nose Day in the UK. They will use those opportunities where people are distracted, people are maybe relaxed a little bit more, maybe people are complacent. And we are certainly in that world right now. We're seeing numbers like this being reported by Action Fraud, which is a part of the National Cybersecurity Centre, the NCSC, part of the government, a body which is there to help protect us as a nation state. But I often say to people that, you know, like any police force, they can't be there all the time. They're not going to walk with you down the street, shoulder to shoulder with you, just in case you get mugged. The first line of defense is you need to be aware of your surroundings. You need to make sure you're walking down the right kind of street. You need to be aware. And we're seeing this kind of attacks coming through currently, where 114 active email campaigns. Notice the word there, that term, active email campaigns. Just like any business, we're going to now carry out attacks to the point where this has risen by 400% in the last 7 weeks. In fact, it's now earning up to more like 500% increase. And that's a real risk, because these attacks are coming and aimed at all different manner of direction. So it doesn't matter who you are, what your particular needs are at this point in time. It's you in the middle. Perhaps you are scared and you're looking for PPE, and then guess what? There's going to be a phishing email that's designed just for you. Maybe you're worried about your finances at the moment. Well, guess what? There's an email that is coming just for you, giving you a mortgage holiday or a loan holiday. The bad guys know that we are currently in this state of concern. And as I've said, we need to think about this, because these risks are simply increasing. And they're increasing not just for organizations. As I've said, cybersecurity for schools has always been an issue. There was a report just last year that talked about that this audit found that barely 1 in 3 schools train their non-IT staff in cybersecurity. Now, if you're non-IT security in cybersecurity, that worries me, because that means perhaps the finance team aren't being told about the potential for phishing attacks. The actual report went on to talk about, of the 430 schools surveyed, that 69% had suffered a phishing attack. Now, when people say to me, I've never suffered a cyber attack, my response to that is, put your hand up if you have never received a phishing email. And if you haven't, then I'd be very surprised. It's rarely happening these days. But if you have had a phishing email, that's an attempt to infiltrate your organization. So if you walk down the street, bringing this back into the real world for a second, if you walk down the street and someone tried to mug you every single step of the way, would you report that to the police? Would you tell somebody? Would you go and arm yourself and improve, maybe not walk down that street, or get better self-defense lessons yourself? You have some form of attack being carried out on you every single day. So that's where we are, but we can't just think this is all about cyber and technology, and if I install malware protection and virus protection and update my laptop with the latest patches, I'll be secure. Because we need to think about the physicality of data as well. In fact, the pharmacy that you see here was last year hit with the largest fine that had ever received by the ICO under GDPR, because they left 500,000 documents in unlocked containers at the back of its premises. And it included names, addresses, dates of birth, medical information. Again, I would ask you to think about, what could you do with that data? What would it mean to a bad guy if they got hold of that information? Or if it got into the wrong hands, how embarrassing would it be? What would be the human impact on those individuals had that information fallen into the wrong hands? For this particular pharmacy, the fine that was levied against them was £275,000, which is, of course, a lot of money. But my fear is that where we hear about these breaches, and I've shown you some of them, that in actual fact, this is just the tip of the iceberg, because we know about the reported incidents, which are purportedly 400, maybe 500% increase on where they were prior to Christmas. They are the unreported incidents that are out there. So many years ago, when I first started investigating and researching this, a police officer said to me, for every single crime that we unearth, fraud within a company, we multiply it by 10, because if it's happening, if we found one person doing it, the likelihood is happening to 10, and people just aren't coming forward because of embarrassment, because of shame, because of fear of losing their jobs. But then there's the unnoticed attacks as well. If someone comes into your house or into your building, into your premises, and steals a TV or a laptop, you notice. If someone steals your car, you notice. If someone steals 10,000 records that you hold, you're not going to know. You're not going to notice that. If there are ghosts in the machine, if there are people, there are hackers inside your systems, then you're not going to know until they let you know, or unless you get somebody in to come in and carry out a test, a review of what you're doing at the moment, how good your defenses are. But that review has to be done by someone who knows what they're doing. It can't be just left to the IT department, because again, it's more than just about technology. Now, I've talked a little or quite a lot about the actual risk and the size and the enormity of this, but who is it who's actually carrying out these kinds of attacks? Well, there is a perception of who they are, but actually this is who they're not. It's not just your lone hacker sat in a basement somewhere with a, hunched over a laptop and wearing a hoodie. Yes, those people do exist. I know several of them. I indeed am one to some extent. I'm known as an ethical hacker now, by the way. That means that I use the same tools and techniques that the bad guys use, but I have a moral compass set slightly differently, so I will always ask permission before I hack into an organization. That's known as penetration tests, if you've ever had one of those carried out. But who are they? Who are the bad guys? Well, they are cyber criminals. They are organized crime or criminal gangs. They've changed their mode of operation from just simply gun running and drugs, because it's far easier to steal £1 from a million different people than steal 1 million from one particular organization or entity. Bank robbery actually now that's the reason why I keep saying that cybercrime has taken an upgrade. It is version 2, because physically walking into a building with a gun is quite dangerous on a number of fronts. Physically, you've got to be in that region. Physically, you've got to get rid of the gun or gain a gun. Physically, you have to then leave that area, and physically, you have to get rid of the money because it may be marked. Far easier for me to hire a hacker. There are hackers for hire. Far easier for me to reach out to students and simply say, fancy earning £500 sat in your bedroom every night. All you need is a bank account and a computer. You might have seen those kinds of signs yourself. If you have, what they're looking for, they are looking to recruit what are known as money mules. These are people with bank accounts. So when you hear about an organization being hit with a large fraud, and the last fraud that I dealt with last week was a mandate fraud. It was a phishing email that came in and said, you need to transfer funds, otherwise we cannot complete this transaction. And it was for £300,000. Within 4 hours, that amount of money, once we were called and once we started to investigate, that amount of money had passed through no less than 8 different bank accounts, nowhere near the perpetrator. So these are the trails that we are expecting the police and the banks to try and catch down. But wouldn't it be far better that we trained our staff, our non-IT staff that mentioned earlier, on cybersecurity and made them aware of how important this stuff is? And of course, one of the other risks that we have is insider threats, insider risks. These are the people who are our own staff, currently furloughed, perhaps currently working disenfranchised at home, maybe kicking their heels, maybe concerned and worried about their own livelihoods, maybe worried about you and your business, but principally worried about themselves and their livelihoods and their families. And maybe this could create a new breed of or a new batch of cyber criminals. Back to the fraud point that I mentioned earlier. That's not to say it's going to happen, but we need to make sure that we don't have any gaps in our thinking around this, and that we are actually looking at our people. But I'll come on to that in a second. The first thing I'm going to say, to repeat myself, is that we cannot hand this over to the IT crowd and simply say, make this work, make me secure, make us secure. You need to make sure that we're thinking broader than that. You need to think about the gaps in your knowledge and your understanding. You need to think about the people. You need to be thinking right now about their mental well-being, obviously for their own sakes and for the sake of your organization, but also because people under, suffering with depression or, feeling anxious and having anxiety and feeling frustrated will make mistakes. They will click on that link. They will think that they have to do something if they receive an email that purports to be coming from your finance department. So you need to start to train your people. Think about some of the risks around them. Think about your premises. You're going to be returning back to work perhaps soon, go back to the workforce. What are the risks that are involved there? Where is your data? Where is the data now that sits in all these different offices and locations? Have you been collecting children's data remotely? Have you been collecting data in a different way? Which comes on to the policies and procedures. What policies and procedures do you have, and what gaps are in your knowledge around those? Perhaps this is a good time to start raising people's awareness of them. And of course, PCs plays a part in this, absolutely. You know, these are the vehicles, and the analogy I always give here is simply saying that, you know, you can't simply say that your car is safe because you check the brakes every single year, you know, and you check the oil. You need to make sure that the driver is safe, making sure that you're driving in a responsible way, which comes back to people. And of course, providers as well. Who are your providers? Are they bringing risks into your organization? Quite often we hear people say, yes, our systems are supported by an IT supplier, so they must look after our cybersecurity. My question is, are you sure? Because I'm not an IT practitioner any longer. I'm a cybersecurity professional. Cybersecurity and data protection is a profession. It is different from IT, and we need to remember that. There are different things that you can do to close some of these gaps. There are international standards for security that cover all of these areas. And this is probably the most widely understood and known, called ISO 27001. And just to look at this for a second, I'm going to draw your eyes to the fact it talks about security policies. It talks about physical and environmental security. It talks about human resource security. It does this in a number of different ways. It's an ISO standard, so it talks about setting the context of the organization. It talks about leadership. Have you planned your security? Do you have the right support in place? Do you have the organizational skills to implement good security? And is there a performance evaluation so that you can improve your security? So these kinds of things are the things that you need to be thinking about. Of course, if you're thinking that that was too complex, then why not look at GDPR in more detail? Because GDPR gives you a roadmap to actually look at, to say, we need to be confident. How confident are we that we are processing data lawfully, fairly, and in a transparent manner? Grade yourself from 1 to 10. 10, we're absolutely smashing it out the park. We've got all the evidence. I can point to things. I can point to people, and I could tell you that it's all going well. 1 is, yeah, I think we need help around this. If you're somewhere around the 5, then you probably do need some help, at least in closing those gaps. Now, it doesn't have to be complex. Of course, sorry, there is the principle of accountability as well within all of this, which I probably should have said is the 7th principle. And that means that someone will be held accountable to data security. So this is what you need to be doing now. This is in the closing remarks of this presentation. Before I hand over to yourself for some questions, my advice to you is this. Number 1, I suppose 0 is do a gap analysis. Where are your gaps in your thinking? But number 1 is develop some clear objectives. Understand why you need to improve your security. And that again comes back to something I said earlier. Just play a game with your senior management team in your own heads. If this data was to fall into the wrong hands, what could be the impact, both on the organization, but more importantly on the individuals, on the data that you're holding? So if this is children's data, what would be the impact of that data falling into the wrong hands? Now, it doesn't have to be complex. If you start to work these things through and it starts to look like this, then you've gone too far. It doesn't need to be complex at all. If you think about what information security actually is, we often talk about something called the CIA triad in information security. And that just simply means confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So think about what you're doing to ensure confidentiality, that is security, the integrity. So how can people trust you? That is what integrity means. GDPR is a great tool to help you assess that. And finally, business continuity. When are my people available? When are my resources available? When is the data available? How can I ensure that those things are in place? The the UK government put together a national cybersecurity strategy back in 2016, which still is in play. And for the entire UK, they boiled it down to just 3 things. We are going to build defenses to prevent bad things happening. We are going to deter cyber criminals from attacking us, and we are going to develop our workforce and our people so that they are better prepared for these kinds of events. Within Cyberfort ourselves, we took a very similar approach, and we just simply said this: our vision is to create a safer society by making cybersecurity easier to understand, which is a big part of, I hope, what I've done today. Think about the plans. What plans do you have in place? Have you any plans at all? What are you doing about your people? And people comes up every single time. And what are your processes, both technical and organizational? Article 32 of the GDPR talks about putting in place appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect data. So what are your technical and organizational measures? Assign responsibility, give this to someone. Don't simply assume that it's IT. This needs to be across the board. Create a security council. Get everybody in your function, in your business, in your organization, in your schools together to say, look, we need to understand from a marketing perspective, what would happen if this data fell into the wrong hands? Sales, what would happen? Finance, what do we need to do? What kind of attacks are likely to happen on you? What do you guys need to know? What do you guys need to do? From there, you're going to start to build up a risk profile, and you can carry out a risk review so that you can actually say, this is what we understand of the risks. And in truth, there is no such thing as 100% secure. I'd love to tell you there was. There are, from a technical point of view, if you're looking into networks and systems, the IT team will tell you that there are 7 layers of security. In fact, there's a layer above that, which I'll come on to in a second, or there's a layer 8. But the point is that you're meant to start to think about the risk to your organization, and then think about the controls that you can put in place to prevent that risk from crystallizing, from actually occurring. Will it stop 100%? No, but I'm guessing here that each of you listening to this now is working remotely. Think about your own homes. Do you only put a lock on the front door because that's where the bad guy, that's where you come in, so that's where the bad guys must come in? Or have you got locks on your windows, on every window, even on the upstairs windows? Because it's a small chance, it's a small risk that someone might break into that small window in the upstairs lavatory. But you've still got a lock on there. And that's exactly what we're looking at here. You're looking at the kinds of risks that are there, and then you're saying, what controls can I put in place that will prevent that risk from crystallizing? And I've already mentioned it several times that people really are your first and last line of defense. A lot of cybersecurity people keep saying the phrase that people are your weakest link. Is not a phrase that I'm a fan of, because I disagree. They are your greatest ally. They are your layer 8 of security. These guys, we often say there's no patch for layer 8, as in it's human nature. Each person you can see on this screen now, each person that's arrived on this webinar has a different world view, a different world opinion, different experiences, different upbringing. So therefore, they will come to this place, cybersecurity, with a different viewpoint. Some will deem it as it's never going to happen to me, I don't really care. And there's going to be others that are really concerned because it perhaps has happened to them. What you need to do is make sure that you train your teams, your people, so that they can understand what the risks are to them. Hopefully put it in the context that is something that they understand, so that they care. As I've already said, if you're simply saying, I train my staff twice a year on cybersecurity, it's not enough. Just because they're aware does not mean they care. So you need to make sure that you meet them in the place that they are and recognize the human aspects of cybersecurity. I would then say, you need to develop a joined up approach to cybersecurity. And that does mean, going back to something I said earlier, talk to different areas of your departments, your functions, bring them together. There are standards out there that can help you. Everything that starts from Cyber Essentials at the very bottom, right all the way up to SOC 1 and SOC 2, which are more American focused regulations and standards and such. So there are different routes you can take. You can see that ISO 27001 features on there, but look at those standards, get help, perhaps, but certainly look at those standards as a way to join up the dots. So finally, I'm going to simply say this. On top of those tips, those practical things you can do, I would simply say this. You need to understand why you need to protect your people, your organizations, why this might be a risk to you. You need to get strong commitment from the top, because if you don't have that commitment, then I'm afraid it's never going to change the culture of the organization. Have that clear objectives in mind, create a plan of action, and definitely get help. The ICO gives lots of great advice and guidance around data protection. Cyberfort, I do personally offer as much assistance as I'm able to. I am an active consultant, so I go out to organizations to put these things into place, but please do reach out. I'm more than happy to help where I can. And finally, just remember that attacks can come from anywhere. You know, we talk about cybersecurity, your laptop may be safe, but you know, people are working remotely right now, and therefore attacks can come from anywhere. So at the end of the day, our goal is simply this, it's thinking about safety and security. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Taria and Liz, and I will take any questions that people may have asked.
Hello everyone, and thank you Gary very much. That was very enlightening and interesting, and I really liked the practical tips that you gave for us all to do. We have time for questions now, so everyone please keep submitting them on the Q&A box on the bottom panel. And we've already got first question for you, Gary.
Fantastic.
We have heard that the ICO is being more lenient during this current pandemic. How true is this?
The ICO have given out lots of advice, great advice, I might add. What they've actually said is that they will be more understanding of the processes involved with GDPR. So they're not saying they're going to go light on people if you have a data breach, but what they have said is that if an organization, for instance, receives a subject access request, those records may be in an office space that people physically can't get to. So the obligation under GDPR is that you have a month to respond to that request. And if you, for instance, if you weren't able to respond to it within that month period, then the ICO would be more relaxed about it. But you would certainly still need to follow your normal process, contact the individuals, made the request, explain the circumstances and give them a reasonable time frame which you can actually carry out that request.
Thank you, that's great. A lot of people are worried about Zoom and how secure it is. Is it secure? Should we use it for business meetings?
Okay, I'm not a Zoom expert. I've said it before that there are no such things as 100% secure. Security on Zoom has improved dramatically over the last 6 weeks. I have some sympathy with Zoom. They went from having 10 million users a day to 300, 400,000, 400 million users per day. So they went global, you know, quite quickly. The security, as I said, has improved. You need to be aware yourself of the security settings. So there are a number of things you can do now when you're setting up a meeting to ensure the security of it, such as locking down the meeting itself, perhaps not sending out the invite early on, you know, putting it out on social media so that anyone can find Zoom meetings and such. In terms of should you use it for business, I would say it comes back to risk again. If we're talking today, you know, using Zoom is perfectly fine. Having a business meeting where you're talking about general things, I think is perfectly fine. If you are a business that is developing the next Chinook helicopter, or if you are offering therapy to children online, there are other platforms I suggested that you would use. But so it depends on context, I guess, is the answer.
Great, thank you. Great practical advice for us there. We have another question. If we install a piece of software to filter the web or check for malware, how do we have assurance it's doing its job? Which standards apply?
Okay, it's an interesting one in as much as depending if we're talking about from a personal device perspective or from a company perspective. Company perspective, and indeed I guess a personal one, is that you should be checking the logs. You should be making sure yourself that the malware protection is working appropriately. ISO 27001 is a security standard which does talk about the fact that monitoring of logs needs to be in place, meaning that somebody should be using some system, some process, whether that be a manual system, a SOC and SIEM type system, through to other various different software tools that allow you to analyze the log files to see if there are any unusual activities. But some of it comes down to just proactively making sure yourself that you are checking that those devices are functioning and up to date on a regular basis.
And would that be the same for a school's point of view than other businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I understand that schools may see themselves as something different, but the bad guys don't. And the way that you protect yourselves shouldn't be seen as anything different. So schools, you've got devices, you've got different risk levels, of course, but you've got endpoint solutions, as it's called. So you have laptops, you have PCs, you have a central server, you have firewall tools, and all of those will have logs that are being generated that if somebody's looking, if someone is actually taking the time to look at those logs, will be able to identify some irregularity or some issues happening. So that's the kind of thing you're looking for. So for instance, again, going back to the insider threat problem I mentioned earlier, data loss prevention software and techniques, or DLP as it's called, this is a system not just looking for incoming traffic, it's looking for outgoing traffic. So these logs will be generated that say, actually, yesterday morning at 2 a.m., 7 gigabytes of information was extracted from these servers at this particular time. Now, these systems quite often will be, depending upon which system you use, will either flag up and say, hey, did you know this is happening? Some will say, stop, we're not allowing that to happen. But that again comes down to your, this is a very technical area, but that's coming down to your IT provider to provide that kind of support. But certainly it comes down to, the logs are being generated, whether you're in a school or whether you're in an organization, someone needs to be checking it.
Thank you, that's great. We have another question. Many students are more likely to have smartphone access than laptops at home. Is there any advice on what platforms and formats are safe and secure for students primarily working on smartphones?
Okay, now again, I'm no expert on school different platforms that you guys are using, but again, there are you can install on these sorts of devices if they are provided by the school, for instance. You can install malware protection on tablet devices, on smart devices. The advice, if it's my advice whenever I go to organizations, is to download and install from reputable sources and have almost a pre-agreed list of devices, not devices, but software applications that have been vetted thoroughly by your organization. Because of course, that question, depends on which applications we're talking about here. And again, I can't speak for every application in the world, but if you coming back to the policies and procedures piece earlier, if you have a set number of applications that you say to students, look, these are acceptable applications and platforms that we want you to use during your coursework, then that's great because you can govern that. But you need to educate them as well about making sure that they are aware of not installing applications from unsecured locations. Now in Apple, that's far easier than it is to control. you know, on other platforms. So it's yeah, so it's about setting some guidelines, I guess, is probably the easiest way to answer that.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. We have another question. So the government, with the pandemic, the government has developed tracking and tracing apps. Are there any security concerns around these?
Yes, in a word. And I say that not because, again, I'm not an expert on those particular apps themselves, but part of the research that I do and part of the work that I'm doing is looking at these kinds of tools. The government recently received a letter from 170 cybersecurity experts. I wasn't one of them, that did raise a lot of concerns around security and privacy. And it's basically, it comes down to this question around security and privacy. So they are two sides to the same coin. That's the way I like to look at it. So are they secure? Well, is the data secure from your device to the government? Then possibly, yeah, probably. Is it private? That's my concern, because when all of this does return to normal, who has access to my data? Who has now got access to my movements? And what, in actual fact, is that app doing on my phone at this point in time? Is it tracking me, purely my location, my GPS location, and who's going to share that information with whom? And but is it tracking other things, where I'm looking on my mobile phone? What devices, what applications have I got installed on my phone? What pictures have I got on my phone? What messages have I got on my phone? So the privacy concerns are more than the security concerns, I think. And I suppose, again, it's one of those things, it depends where you sit on the conspiracy wedge. If you're at the thick end, then you'll be thinking this is the government's attempt to take control and be able to govern us and own us and understand everything about us. And then at the other end, it's like, yeah, I'm not sure I care. You know, if the government wants to track me, I don't really care. I sit somewhere in the middle, and I'm a pessimistic optimist, which basically means that I know bad things are going to happen, but I always think there's some good that we can do with that, and we will get our way through it. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yes. Well, certainly my own question, worry about this tracking app. Yes, thank you, Gary.
I think it's just that, it's that idea of scope creep. And we can use the word creep really, you know, in every connotation really, which is at this point in time, I think, you know, absolutely right. We should absolutely be, you know, doing all we can to combat this situation that we're in right now. My concern is when this all turns to normal, I've not seen anything in the privacy policies, and I am one of those people who does read the T's and C's on applications and systems. I've not seen anything yet that gives me 100% confidence that says, when all this returns to normal, we will delete all the data because we will no longer need it. And that comes back to GDPR. And that's why, again, I'm a bit of a fanboy when it comes to GDPR, because it speaks to me. It talks about my data and my rights as an individual and my right to privacy. And I'm a little bit concerned that given time, that privacy might be eroded through apps like this that are purportedly put in place for good, but then can suddenly, and oops, we didn't realize this has happened. And that's my concern. Yeah,
thank you for that. We have another question. So we use G Suite for education. Much of his data is held in the cloud-based. Can we ask Google where it's held and how secure it is? Would we be lacking if we don't ask?
Okay, so fairly easy one to answer. Yes, absolutely. You don't have to ask Google. You can ask, you can ask Google. They will tell you it's probably held in in European data centers and such. You should ask the question, and you can Google it. So you can talk about G Suite security. If you type in G Suite security 27001 SOC 2, that's SOC 2, you're more likely to find the page that you need. And I would suggest you would be, it demonstrates good practice to ask your suppliers where they're storing your data. So even someone like Google, you know, they're not going to, Mark Zuckerberg's not going to pick up the phone to you and talk to you from a position of Facebook or anything like that. But you can look at these systems and you can look at their security, and you can download their security page. So if there ever was a problem, again, going back to the risk assessment that you did earlier and the controls that you put in place, you can evidence that you took all reasonable steps, that you did actually research the security on something as big as Google G Suite, and you looked at every other application that you used, irrespective of its size. So you should be asking the question. It should become part of your normal supplier review process, which every organization should have.
Thank you. We have perhaps time for one more question. So GDPR is a minefield for small primary schools. The schools I work for outsource their responsibilities to companies offering a service to ensure they are compliant. What should schools look out for when choosing a contractor?
Okay, so first thing I would say is that I've been a DPO for 20 years, so a data protection officer. GDPR is not, it shouldn't be a minefield. The contractor that you work with, the organization that you work with, should help you understand that GDPR is what's known as an outcome-focused regulation. That means it has the principles, the 6 or 7 if you count accountability principles in place. It's up to you to build a body of evidence that demonstrates you've done all the things that it's required to do. So what you should be looking for really is, you know, what are the credentials? How long have they been in data protection and cyber security as well? Because that's an important aspect. As a DPO, you need to have an understanding of the technical aspects of security as well as the compliance issues around legal and regulatory frameworks. So I'm lucky to be in that position because of my background in IT and then data protection. If the organization that you've given this to is a law firm, then you need to get some assurances and comfort that they understand the technical aspects as well. So what are they doing around the 6th principle about confidentiality and security? And if they're an IT company, or if it feels like they're more of an IT company, what do they understand about legal frameworks and regulatory frameworks? Because it's not just data protection laws. There's other things that's in there as well, like human rights and European law as well around data protection. Do your background research. And if all else fails, drop me a line and I will tell you if I've heard of them. And sometimes I will, sometimes I won't. I don't know everybody, of course, but at least I can point you towards some good people.
Thank you. We are coming to the end of our webinar now, but if you have any further questions for Gary, you can see his contact details on the screen. And after this webinar, we'll email everyone a recording of the webinar with Gary's presentation. And thank you, Gary, very much again. And thank you for everyone who attended today. All the best. Hopefully we will see you again soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Gary. Have a good day.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.